Hey everybody, my name's Tom. I'm going to be talking a little bit about this Blue-Red Hot Wheels deck that One Chin Lee built for the Easter Highlander event in Melbourne, and she has been tinkering with it ever since. The cornerstone of this deck is that it's fundamentally a red aggro deck, which is fairly obvious from the cards that you can see in front of you. But it has a few interesting backdoor combo options and lock pieces that you usually try to accelerate out. We're leaning quite hard into that theme, so we're playing Mox Ruby, Mox Sapphire as 6 points, and then we're also going to play Chrome Mox and Simian Spirit Guide to further the acceleration plan, and then the last point is Time Twister. The fundamental principle of this deck is that you want to attack very quickly, and about 70% of the cards are quite unremarkable towards that purpose. You see Goblin Guide, Grim Lavamancer, Swift Spear, Eidolon, Robber, Goblin Rebel Master, Legion Warboss, Koth at the top end. Those are all doing the same thing that red aggro decks are always doing. There are just a few aspects of the deck that are particularly interesting or particularly unique, and knowing when to pivot to those or knowing when those are going to be the most important thing to do does take a little bit of getting used to. So I think there are probably two plan Bs. Obviously, plan A is attack and deal 20 damage to your opponent as quickly as possible. Plan B involves the combo. So let's move the Fire Blast over here. The 4 combo pieces of Hull Breacher, Time Twister, Narset, and Wheel of Fortune exploit the synergy between drawing 7 cards and these obnoxious cards saying that your opponent isn't allowed to draw extra cards. Hull Breach is particularly notable because instead of stopping them from drawing cards, it stops them from drawing cards and makes you a treasure token, which means your new grip of 7 can be immediately played, and if you happen to draw into another wheel, you in fact just get to go again. This is quite powerful, and Hull Breacher having flash does set up quite a lot of turn 2 in your end step play Hull Breacher, and you're tapped out, I untap, play a wheel effect, and the game's over. That's certainly one viable way to win. And the second plan B option are these obnoxious lock pieces here. So Blood Moon and Magoose of the Moon win the game against a certain percentage of decks in the format when you catch them without a basic land in play. And Sulfuric Vortex is similarly not quite as hard a lock piece, but similarly many decks have no way to remove it, and it ticks down, it locks some of their outs which involve gaining life, and usually your deck's able to get them to 8 life, 10 life fairly efficiently, and then Vortex can do the rest whilst you stall for time. So knowing when to pivot to one of these plans, when you want to jam Blood Moon on turn 3, or turn 2 hopefully, or when you're just playing the beatdown strategy is something that's hard to figure out. You need to obviously know what your opponent's doing, but usually I don't aggressively go for the combo unless my opponent is playing a much faster deck than me, or they're playing something that is just going to kill my creatures and I have to hope that I'll find another way to win. The combo I try to just assemble organically. Your opponent's going to trade cards with you quite aggressively because your things are cheap and deal them damage, and they need to stop that from happening, which usually means that by the time you draw into both of these cards, you'll be able to stick one of them. The lock pieces, Blood Moon and Magoose, are usually quite good to just jam when you can, but Vortex is one that's a little tricky. Often Vortex ends up killing you if you're a little cavalier about it, especially against mid-range decks where a Questing Beast or another large, dumb, green idiot just runs rampant through your small creatures. So those are the 2 plan Bs. The other notable cards that you should be aware of, obviously Price of Progress is the sort of quintessential one time where it will win you games that no other card could. And Exquisite Firecraft is also the fact that it can't be countered, often lets you force your opponent to waste mana when they've taken a turn off to try and save themselves from taking damage. And I think the other card that's a little unclear is the Royal Scions. This is a card that is certainly highly polarized. It's much better against fair mid-range decks because giving your creatures trample, let's make it larger, giving your creatures trample really lets you force an extra 3 or 4 damage through a mana elf that was otherwise planning to jump block. Everything else here is fairly straightforward. I don't think there are any significant surprises. if you wanted to change the deck list, some of the cards that could be on the chopping block. Delver of Secrets, despite being Delver, there are not a lot of hits for Delver in this deck. We play quite a lot of Planeswalkers, quite a lot of enchantments for a deck of this size. Delver is a feasible card to be considering cutting. Harsh Mentor is a card that I was considering putting in. I don't think I would cut Robber of the Rich for it, but it's certainly something, maybe Mental Misstep, you decide you don't want to play in the main deck, you can move it to the sideboard and you can get a Harsh Mentor in. I did feel the deck could use a couple of other hate pieces at 2 and 3 mana. Firebolt is another card that if you're not worried about going up against turn 1 green creatures, could be on the chopping block in order to bring in something that you feel is a little more flexible. There's no hard and fast rule about how you build the deck, but I think that these cards are obviously untouchable. You need to play these, and a certain number of the very good cards like Goblin Guide, Grim Lavamancer, Lightning Bolt are obviously not cards you're going to cut. But otherwise, you can tailor, like Chandra Acolyte of Flame, I think is very good. Getting to flashback a burn spell, potentially a wheel, but usually a burn spell kind of pushes it over the top. But certainly, you could turn into a different 3-drop. The other notable factor is your mana base is quite good. You can sometimes get yourself into some difficult situations because you'll need 2 blue for Narset, and you'll end up in these awkward spots where you don't really want to fetch Basic Island, but you might have a Blood Moon in your hand and you don't want to lock yourself out of casting Narset. Or you might be concerned about having Mishra's Factory needing to attack with it and dealing with the double pipped spells. The thing I would advise you to do is prioritize getting 2 mountains into play for Fire Blast. Losing a game because you don't have 2 mountains and this would win is obviously very unpleasant. Otherwise, the mana base doesn't have too many significant factors to it. You need to be a little bit careful with Ancient Tomb and Barbarian Ring. You can sometimes deal yourself so much damage that your opponent can steal a game out of nowhere. But otherwise, getting free damage out of your lands is phenomenal. I think that in terms of the deck construction, that's probably all there is to it. It's not remarkably different from a red aggro deck. It's just you have this backdoor combo. Then, in terms of playing the deck and what you want to be thinking about when you look at your first 7 cards, although this is a red aggro deck, one of the traps that you can fall into is not realizing that you're playing 7 cards here, maybe 8 if you count Price of Progress, that are worth significantly more than the 1 card you're getting out of most of your cards. And keeping a hand that is simply 3 lands, 4 spells may not necessarily be the best thing you can do, especially when you might just keep a couple of burn spells, a couple of creatures, and your opponent gets to trade a removal spell and a counter spell, and suddenly it's turn 4 and they're still at 15 life. I do look quite heavily for either acceleration or lock pieces in my first 7. The fact that we're playing 4 pieces of mana acceleration, obviously Simon Spirit Guide is a 1-use card, but it still lets you power something out ahead of time. The fact that we're playing 4 of them means you can quite reasonably expect to see one in your opening couple of hands. It's akin to 40% to see a playset of a card in regular constructed. And even if it's just casting Eidolon on turn 1, or just a big 3-drop on turn 2, that really does break the parity, especially on the draw, where your opponent might tap out for a 2-drop thinking that they have time, and suddenly you're jamming one of these things and the game's over. In terms of what hands I look to keep with a mulligan, you're not actually a burn deck despite what you look like, so don't be overly seduced by keeping hands with 3 or 4 burn spells. You'll end up drawing into Goblin Guide and Robber of the Rich on turn 3 and 4 and struggling to force damage through. You can often end up with a glut of 3-drops in your opening hand because, so 5+ doesn't count, price goes there. But these cards all cost 3 mana, and the printed mana cost of Borrower and Bone Crusher Giant also puts them into this column. I'm usually not terribly worried about that. I obviously don't want to keep a hand that is, say, 3 lands, 4 3-drops. But having more 3-drops is not necessarily the worst thing in the world because they are the cards in your deck that are going to win you the game. And again, with the acceleration thing, you're going to get to play them on turn 2 quite a significant percentage of the time. In terms of matchups, you will figure out very quickly that the Planeswalkers are very bad against some decks. I mean, Royal Scions is a card that is highly polarized. You can sideboard it out quite freely against combo decks because it is essentially blank. Other cards like Exquisite Firecraft really shine against control decks, against the aggro mirror, or you don't want to be paying 3 mana to destroy a creature or 3 mana to go to the face. You have much more efficient cards to do that. Although acknowledging the fact that against the aggro mirror you have a lot more cards you need to cut, like your Blood Moons, your Price of Progress. The overall principle is, I think, that you're usually the control deck against the aggro mirror because you have this backdoor combo and you are playing Time Twisters and Wheel of Fortunes, which are a little scary. But if you can break the parity by removing their creatures and surviving to turn 4 and 5 to do this, you'll run away with the game, whereas they don't have that aspect. They have to just go faster than you, because the longer the game goes, your Planeswalkers can take it over. They might not be playing Fiery Confluence. They probably are playing Fiery Confluence. But you can certainly take over a game in a way that they can't. And then finally, in terms of the sideboard, this sideboard here is what I played recently at Easter. There's nothing too remarkable about it. You certainly need to tailor it for what you think is going to happen. If you're playing in the Magic Online League for the free Mox Emerald, you should probably just look at the deck lists. I suspect that Storm is going to be less represented than it was at Easter when I knew who was in the room and who was going to be playing it. So cards like Fairy Macabre and Grafdigger's Cage could certainly go down in popularity. I think one of the strengths of this deck is you get to play 4 blasts, 5 if you want to play Flash Flood. I would play a Pyroclasm. I quite like the ability of Pyroclasm to get me out of jail against red decks, which are probably the number one threat after winning both events in the last month. Fluster Storm. Negate's also an eminently cuttable card, but I think that these 5 cards are essential. I really like having something that can kill big creatures against fair decks. So the Pyroclasm will go over here. So Dismember, Flame Slash is another card that could replace Dismember, something that can kill a Questing Beast type card. And then Submerge is a free spell that your deck really leverages quite well. So I'd play at least 2 ways to remove a big creature. And then the rest is just tailoring against decks you want to hate out. I played a Negate as a catch-all, which I wasn't super impressed with. But I think Null Rods and Smash to Smithereens are exactly the cards you want against big artifact decks. If you're worried about the Underworld Breach combo deck, the Null Rod type effects become a lot better. But I was worried enough about mid-rangey artifact decks running around that I wanted the 3 damage off Smash to Smithereens, but do be aware that this is not realistic hate against artifact combo. Ashiok is another card that... Ashiok Dreamrend is another card that is replaceable, but is never going to be terribly out of place in your sideboard. Notably, if you're not aware of how this card works, you don't need to target your opponent in order to exile their graveyard. So the way the card's templated says that you exile each opponent's graveyard regardless of who you targeted, which often comes up if you're worried about Veil of Summer or similar. But the ability to power this out to turn ahead of schedule, turn off your opponent's lands perhaps, which is a minor annoyance, but then shut them down from comboing and lock out their graveyard, often gets you over the edge, gets you over the line, because you only need a thin edge with this deck to convert it into 20 points of damage. And I played 3 cards as anti-combo cards. I think the Cage is similarly fairly replaceable. I really like Fairy Macabre, the uncounterable nature of it, and the fact that you can play it on turn 0 makes me a little... It's probably the card I would prefer to play, although Surgical Extraction is certainly better in quite a few circumstances. And then the last card here that I played on the day was Niv Mizzet Perun, which, if you've seen the deck list, shouldn't really be there. I just didn't have a 15th card to play. Flash Flood, which I mentioned before, is a perfectly reasonable answer. It's a Terminate against Mono Red, which is a deck that is apparently going to be popular and is quite good. Other cards you can consider, Mindbreak Trap if you wanted more hate against Storm decks, or you could really just play any one of the powerful blue sideboard cards, like tip of the tongue moment. The mental misstep was originally in the sideboard before I moved it to the main deck. So there are quite a number of blue cards that target specific decks. You could play Trickbind if you're particularly worried about Thassa's Oracle and you wanted a way to definitively beat them. I don't think it really matters too much. One of the strengths of this deck is that one sideboard card often goes a lot further because you're trying to close the game out quite quickly. If you have any particular thoughts about how to build the deck or how to change the deck, you can certainly get in touch with me via the 7 Point Highland Discord. But One Chin Lee has put a lot of work into this, so the Hot Wheels deck is very much her creation that I stole when she wasn't playing the event, and I borrowed her deck list. I don't think there are any notable traps. I think the thing that I struggled with the most was recognizing that your lock pieces and your combo pieces are worth far more cards than you think they are. I'd prioritize these over cards like Incinerate or standard red aggro cards in a mulligan. You want to have at least one powerful 3-drop that you can try and accelerate out, even if you have to draw the acceleration. Otherwise, this deck has been a lot of fun to play. It's a very difficult deck to build a budget copy of if you're interested in playing in paper. You can't really cut the Moxen, unfortunately, and the 7th point's Time Twister, so you're on the hook for 3 pieces of power straight off the bat. If you wanted to make some budgetary cuts and cut the Moxen and replace them with things like Lutri the Spell Chaser, Wasteland, Strip Mine type cards, I think you need to fundamentally rework the deck. I'd remove the Hull Breach or Time Twister Narset Wheel of Fortune combo. You might still decide to play Wheel of Fortune, but I think the combo only works because you can accelerate it out. Otherwise, yeah, I hope you very much enjoy playing the deck if you decide to pick it up. It's a total blast. I think I've recorded a couple of matches with it in the past, and you could see them on this YouTube channel if they eventually ever get uploaded. But otherwise, yeah, please pick it up and play it. It's quite a lot of fun. And otherwise, good luck in the Moto League.